what does it mean to be living? I mean, everyone knows what it means to be living, right? Well, we're talking about living, though, in the context of the law of identity. We're searching for God. And we've defined, or we're theorizing, that God is the greatest conceivable being. So, in the context of that, we've developed and gone through what do we know? And we know with 100% certainty the law of identity. Everything has an identity, no matter what it is. It has some certain properties that uniquely identify that particular item. And for God, or the greatest conceivable being, the first thing we theorized was that God should be a being. It should exist and have its own entity, whatever that might be. Now we're also saying the theory is that God should be living. I mean, that just makes sense, right? But I mean, what does it mean for God to be living? And I'm not talking about in some religious context. I'm just talking about if we just think about it, if we're just theorizing what God should be. What does it mean to be living if you're the greatest conceivable being? So, I mean, it seems like it should be an easy answer. So in my previous video, I talked a little bit about, we understand about reproduction and growth, those things we identify with living, breathing, respirating. But as we talk to God, do we know that God has some type of physical entity? I mean, centuries ago, people thought gods were a body. Does God have to have a body? Could God be immaterial? So what would that look like to be a living being as the greatest conceivable being? So we've gotten away from, and let's get away from this material versus immaterial. That's not in this discussion at this point. We're going to discuss it at some point, but not at this point. So living in the context. So in the previous video, I talked about three primary things. I said a living being should have, in the context of God, or the greatest conceivable being, should have a mind, a will, and the ability to carry out that will. So what does that mean? Well, a mind, I mean, we kind of understand what a mind is. The ability to be able to talk, to speak, to be able to think and plan out. So, we think about something living like a tree. We don't see any signs that a tree has a mind, that it has something that it can think about. But more than that, let's say that we had somebody like, good example might be Stephen Hawking. Brilliant man. Brilliant. He had a mind. Brilliant mind. So, but his body really couldn't move. He had a hard time doing much other than just moving his head. But he had a wonderful mind. And then we theorized, could a being be completely made out of gamma rays? Or could a being have no body and just be a mind? And there's no hands like we're thinking of. Sure, it'd be hard to comprehend, but we could theorize that. But also, when we think of a being with a mind, something that's living, that being also then has a will, some desire, something that they want, or that they want to accomplish, or they desire to accomplish. So if we go back to an example of the tree, no obvious signs of mind, no obvious sign of will. We see the leaves move with the sunlight, and it kind of, you can even see them and slowly twist and follow the sunlight, but there's no will that we see. We look at a mouse or some other animal, and we see that they plan out to go after some food that they desire, and you can see that they're going out after that. In our case of Stephen Hawking, he still had a will. He wrote books. He used his mind, and other people may have had to write it for him, but he had a will. And so we see that and as our greatest conceivable being, to be living should have this mind, will, and then the last thing we're saying is that the greatest conceivable being should have the ability to carry out its will. That seems logical. All religions kind of point to that. You have a mind, something you can think about, and a will, and you can carry out your will. So whether the greatest conceivable being is a material being, an immaterial being, or some mix of both, whether the greatest conceivable being is somewhere localized in some body form or completely omnipresent, the logical thing that this greatest conceivable being should be in terms of identity should be a mind, a will, and the ability to carry out the will. You know, one of the things I love is we live in a time, and you're going to hear me say this again and again, that we've been given so much information. We're exploding with it, with millennia of philosophy and things that people have thought through, and that we can go back and use to help us in this search for God and the greatest conceivable being. And so all of these things that I'm using, all of these ideas are generally not my own. I was able to get the law of identity through the people who worked it out. This idea of a mind, even though we struggle to define what a mind really is, we recognize the characteristics of intelligence. We recognize the characteristics of what a mind can do. And there's different levels of mind, from the smallest mouse up to a human being, up to God, up to these other amazing creatures that might know a lot more than what we know. But we recognize the science. And then when we see a mind, we see a being that can then carry out what that mind wills. And in a mouse's case, it's little things. It's just going after food. It's finding places to hide. It's escaping from predators. And then you move up to something like a chimpanzee that has a little bit more social order that you might see. And then you move up to human beings who can create things and design things and have all this wonderful electronic stuff around. And we have these amazing books that people have put together because of a mind, a will, and the ability to carry out that will. So the greatest conceivable being, the identity of God, the identity of the greatest conceivable being, is a being who exists and is living with a mind, a will, and the ability to carry out that will. Those are our steps. Now, the next video will be on what does it mean to be all-knowing. And that'll be something that's really fun, something that we're going to really theorize and dig into a little bit more. If you like the idea of contemplating what it means to be living, check out my website. Put a link in the description below and right here on the screen, againstallheresies.org. There's an interesting discussion I found. It's about 45 minutes long, but it has Richard Dawkins, renowned atheist. He's on a panel with multiple other people, and they discuss what does it mean to be living. And they talk about these different categories. It's very fascinating, interesting. I encourage you to go check out the website and click on the link. It's in YouTube. And there's other resources there as well. Again, thank you so much for joining me and following me along on these videos and this journey that we're going through on the search for God.